Appreciate everybody coming out after lunch. I'm going to do my best to keep everyone active throughout the next about 40 minutes, just so that at least half the crowd doesn't fall asleep. But since there's probably going to be some stragglers coming in here, I figured I'd introduce myself first, because most people don't really care anyway. So the people that come in a few minutes late won't really miss anything. I'm Mike Viscuso. I currently work at Carbon Black from the United States. I got my start at the National Security Agency. Probably familiar to most people here what it is that they do. I went there thinking I was going to do crypto work for the rest of my career, and found out very quickly that although I had a natural aptitude for it, it wasn't exactly something that kept me there after hours, right? And the frustrating part of it was that as I was sitting there with 60 PhD mathematicians trying to break some very strong encryption algorithms, plastered all over the news were the 16-year-old, what is deemed as script kiddies, breaking into DoD networks, right? And stealing everything that I was hoping to get once I decrypted this message. And that got me thinking that, maybe I wasn't really applying my skills in the right area, right? And so I moved over while at the National Security Agency. I moved over to doing red teaming and penetration testing to hone in my skills on a variety of things, to include vulnerability research and exploit development and other things. And this seemed to really tickle my fancy, right? It was the perfect balance between being an absolute nerd, which I will always be, and a rule breaker, right? So between the two of them, vulnerability research, exploit development, implant persistence, covert comms, all really tickled my fancy. From there, I went to a defense contractor, Mantech, and from Mantech, I helped start Kairos and now Carbon Black. So I will warn you that after my talk, if you come up to me and talk about anything on this screen right now, you'll probably be there for at least 2 hours. So you will not be able to get me to shut up. I will sit here and talk about any one of these topics for as long as you can possibly stand before you decide to just leave me talking to nobody. So things I'm interested in, if you would like to talk afterwards, any one of these things. But like I said, it is after lunch, and so in order to get people to interact a little bit, I've put together a small little activity for us all. Okay, and it's going to follow the theme of the presentation, but it'll at least keep us engaged. In fact, I'll know who's sleeping because they won't be participating in the activity. It's not a bad thing, it's just I'll know. Okay, and what I did was I had a standard set of playing cards on this table. Okay, all 52 cards arranged in order. And what I did was I had 7 of the first people that walked in the door come up here and take a card. Okay, symbolizing the taking of records, right? So when in fact a network is breached, one of the goals is of course to take some of the data and exfil it out, right? So I simulated that by having 52 cards, a standard playing deck up here, and I had 7 people come up and take a single card, okay? And throughout the presentation, you'll see several slides that look exactly like this. And what I would like is for those people to raise that card, face forward, and then hand it to somebody else. Okay? So whenever you see this slide, I'd like you to raise your card and then hand it to somebody else. If you don't have a card, I'd simply like you to just raise your hand. Okay? And then put it down once the slide goes down. And my 2 volunteers, Rich and Gunther here, are going to try to figure out which cards were taken. Okay? Sort of a real-world analogy to a typical incident response case. So, Rich, if you wouldn't mind coming up here and sitting on this chair, and Gunther, if you wouldn't mind just coming up here and sitting on this chair, that way you can see everybody when they raise the cards, you can see what it is that they're raising, and you can write it down. I put a little notepad here with a pencil.
In fact, you put a gun behind me.
Well, this is what I didn't tell you. So the loser, this is a race, and the loser gets executed. So I would put your bifocals on if you have them, and everyone who has a card knows now what they're supposed to do. Okay, all right. So let's just practice real quick here. Okay, so I'm going through my presentation. You see this slide. Everyone raises their hand. Some of them have a card in them. Others do not. The next slide goes down, right? If you have a card, hand it to somebody else. If you don't have a card, look around for someone handing you a card, okay? You guys got it? We good? 7 cards are out there.
He's got glasses, haven't he?
So the difference here is that I was recording the whole thing, Gunther, when they were taking the cards. So I'll just show you how to work my camera here. There's the recording right there. You just hit this up button, and it'll play them taking the cards, okay? And so, like I said, the first person to actually figure out which cards were taken won't get executed, okay? All right. So that's just the activity to make sure I'm keeping you guys engaged. But now on to the real presentation here. So security experts have all come to agreement that it's not a matter of if, but when your network will be penetrated, okay? And no matter what data breach report you look at, whether it's TrustWaves or Mandiant's or Verizon, you start to see a common theme, and that is that these are not just statements, right? These are very, very true. In fact, just to highlight 3 of the statistics in the Verizon data breach report, the first that I'm going to highlight is that 95% of all compromised records were due to malware, okay? The second is that 85% of those intrusions, which led to malware, took weeks or more to discover, okay? The last is that an overwhelming majority, in fact, 92% of those intrusions were identified through a third party, okay? So if you put these 3 together, you start to paint a pretty good picture, and that is that malware is a big problem. Most people don't even know when they have the problem, and wouldn't know unless someone outside told them about it. And so this, this blind faith in prevention products has led to a situation where they've put all of the eggs in one basket. Okay, so we've got the vast majority of the security investment put into protection or prevention, and very little put into any of the others, which has led to a blind faith in prevention products, and essentially all of the eggs in one basket, such that when this basket does fall, because remember, it's not a matter of if, but when, you're left with a pretty big mess on your hands, okay? And this is a very small mess in comparison to the mess that you would normally see. And in addition, it's also led to an environment where most people with this blind faith have sort of gotten to the point where they're not doing verification on their own that their network is secure. They've put this trust in these products. And so when, in fact, a breach does occur, like any headline, I'm not picking on Zappos here, I could have taken any headline here. When, in fact, this happens, it's the first time that this organization has actually started to recognize their data for what it really is. And it seems to be, from their perspective, flying all over the place. It's the first time that they've actually said, wait, is this normal? Is this something I should be concerned about? Is this access something I've seen before? And by that part, it's too late. And so you've got a few different types of responses, right? And not all of them are represented here, but I thought it was a pretty good picture. You've got some people just trying to pick up the mess, right? Just gather anything they possibly can to pick up the mess, okay? How you doing, Gunther? You got it all now?
I think so.
All right, okay, so Gunther took about 4 minutes, and I think he's been done for quite a while now. You can go back to your seat if you feel more comfortable there. Rich,
See some slides.
yeah, just let me know when you're even close to being done. Okay, thanks. You see some other guys that are just reaching for whatever they can possibly put their hands on, right? And then you've got some people that are just sitting there dumbfounded, like, what is it that I do now, right? And so it's about Friday, 5 o'clock, and some people in this room may know exactly what I'm talking about. And they finally figure out that they can't handle this incident themselves, and so they call in outside expertise. Okay, I know that it's Friday at 5 o'clock because I'm usually the guy that gets that call on Friday at 5 o'clock right before I'm about to enjoy my weekend. And in fact, this breach, they've known about this breach since Tuesday morning, and yet they've been trying to do what they can to handle it, and now it's time to go home, and the breach isn't anywhere close to being complete. In fact, they're nowhere closer than where they were before. And so my team rolls in here, and we're doing everything we can, and we're using a variety of techniques, but they're all reactive, right? They're all at the point where we're using snapshots in time to be able to try to recreate a crime scene that may have happened, I don't know, Tuesday is when they found out about it. It may have happened right then, or it may have happened a year ago, right? And so the validity of each one of these things is ultimately in question, and it takes a lot of time for us to even gather the intelligence we need to start doing any sort of analysis at all. And most importantly, it requires an expert, right? So to interpret what it is that a file in this particular location means requires someone who has actually seen a bunch of breaches before and can say, yes, this is a common technique or not, okay? The standard IT security person or just IT guy is not going to have that level of depth of knowledge or experience simply because that's not what they do all day and that's not what they get paid for. And so the vast majority of this digital investigation that we perform is going to be forensics based. Okay, we have other things in our bag, other tools in our bag, which I'm not sure if you can see that or not, but verbal interrogation and sometimes a little bit of replay through logs. Okay, but largely the vast majority of the data we get in order to perform analysis comes from some form of forensics, whether that's log file forensics or file system forensics, whatever it might be, it's largely forensics. And when I say forensics, what I'm really saying is deriving conclusions based on a data point, okay? Deriving hypotheses based on a data point. It's not actually clear cut and dry, this is what happened, or else we wouldn't be there, okay? And not only is this very disruptive and take a lot of time, and the C-suite is all very upset about it and pinging me every hour about what it is that I know now, it's costing a lot of money. And I make a good rate, but it takes this much time, and therefore, when you look at the average cost of a breach, and a lot of people reference like Ponemon and other people, to each their own, but I prefer to use the Net Diligence Report. It's probably not a common household name, but their study actually uses insurance claims instead of survey results. And I find that that's a much better source of data, A, because it's conclusive. This is how much the insurance company paid, but also because the insurance company is much more diligent about tracking costs, because that's ultimately what they're insuring against. And so each one of the policies, the data breach policies, has these bins. And so you may have a $1 million aggregate or a $250,000 per occurrence for each one of these things. Okay? And you see at the far left here that forensics is close to about $200,000 per breach. So people are paying about $200,000 every time they have a breach just to figure out what happened, right? And the reason that they're doing this is because if forensics can determine that no records were taken, the rest of these costs go to zero, right? So if you look at credit monitoring or breach notification or legal defense or settlement, which make up the vast majority of the rest of the costs of a breach, if forensics can prove that no records were actually taken, you don't have to pay any of those. So companies are willing to spend the money on this forensics, but really if they had the choice, they certainly wouldn't be paying $200,000 just to figure out what happened. And as regulations start to increase around this area, forcing, we're very close here. EU requires that you have 24-hour response time. You're supposed to disclose everything you know after a 24-hour period. Most people would say it's preposterous. Forensics can't possibly take 24 hours. It can't possibly be done in 24 hours or less. As these regulations start to continue to add more clauses, to add more requirements to this list, that $200,000 figure is just going to go through the roof. In fact, this study was the 2010 study. The 2011 study, which Mark, who does the study for Net Diligence, approved that I disclose this, even though he hasn't disclosed the report, is actually $341,000. So you see about a 75% increase in 1 year, whereas the vast majority of the other costs have gone down. Forensics costs have almost doubled, okay? And most of it is the result of these regulatory authorities coming down on the companies who have had a breach, making sure that they're doing the proper things. Rich, I'll hold it up here a little longer for you. All right, sorry, that's it. And when you compare that cost, that $200,000 cost, or more recently, $341,000 cost, to the cost that an attacker has to incur in order to avoid the prevention mechanisms that everyone's relying on, you see a stark difference. And I'm going to cite Krebs's article here, where he says that for Citadel, you can purchase it for about $2,400 as the base package, and then you can have an add-on, which is about $400 additional, that allows you to automatically evade the latest antivirus signatures. Okay, so we're talking about a $2,800 expense in order to make sure that your kit can avoid everything, or I shouldn't say everything, but most things that people are relying upon. Okay. So just, I'm a math guy by nature, so I figured, well, let's just do an actual assessment here. So the base costs with just buying Citadel, the kit, and then the malware package for signaturing, it's going to cost me about $2,800. And then each breach, since I don't really have to pay for the kit itself again, goes up about $400 per breach. Yet the Defender, since each breach is a new breach, since we can't actually tie two breaches together or really use any of the characteristics of the old one for the new one because we can't guarantee it's a false negative problem, we have to spend this $200,000 every time. And again, this is $200,000 in 2010. The more updated number is $341,000. So we'd have to go all the way down to the 1400th breach before the attacker has spent as much as the Defender to defend the first one. So it doesn't take a genius to figure out that this simply just isn't sustainable. To spend $200,000 to figure out what happened compared to the $3,000 that an attacker has to spend just simply isn't sustainable.
Someone's holding it back to front. That's not fair.
Yeah. Make sure it's front for him. He's already up here feeling bad about himself. How's that gun feeling behind you, by the way?
It's good.
Yeah. And when you compare this digital response, when you compare the digital response cases to the real world, you'll notice some similarities and then some differences, right? So some of the similarities are that, in fact, they do employ traditional prevention techniques the same way our digital component does. They have bulletproof glass and locks. But they've already come to the realization that those things aren't going to suffice all the time. Okay, they've gone through this mess before. They've realized how expensive forensics is and to hire a detective. And they realized that, well, we could save a lot of that by just simply putting in place a surveillance camera. Now, a surveillance camera isn't going to get you fingerprints, but it sure will tell you where to look for them or if you're even going to find them. Okay? And in fact, 7-Eleven isn't the only place. Surveillance cameras are everywhere. I mean, just even think, in the hall we were just in the reception area, there were 4 surveillance cameras. It's not necessarily that this place wants to be broken into. It just knows that if, in fact, it does get broken into, it has all the data that it can hand off to a detective to say, hey, this is what happened. Okay? And so if you look at the traditional investigation that a detective has to go through, it's a lot more replay. And I'm not a detective, right? I'm not a cop. So I can't really say that this is proper alignment here, but they have an advantage in the fact that they oftentimes have these surveillance cameras, and when they don't, they seek them out, right? Surveillance cameras on ATMs and other things. They seek them out because they recognize that the replay actually is conclusive evidence, whereas someone telling me about what happened could differ from person to person. So the value associated with replay is actually much higher because it's conclusive and it's its view stays the same. And if you look, forensics is actually far smaller in a case like 7-Eleven. We're not doing blood splatter analysis or fingerprint detection on every single crime. We're largely relying on the surveillance cameras to tell us what happened. And so when you look at these two side by side, you notice a very stark difference. Digital investigations tend to use forensics as the majority of their tool set, whereas real world tends to use replay. And if you just try to throw a general wag at how much each of these costs, not making the assumption necessarily that forensics costs more, you just look at the attributes that make it costly, right? So requiring an expert, taking a lot of time, very disruptive, and the quality of the results, each incurring some sort of dollar cost figure. You look at replay and it doesn't require an expert. It doesn't really take a whole lot of time. It's not disruptive, and the quality of the data is actually pretty good. Whereas interrogation requires an expert to get the right data out, doesn't really take a whole lot of time, isn't necessarily very disruptive, and but the quality you're not really sure. If I were to ask Rich what happened here, he might give me a different answer than Gunther, right? But forensics seems to have all of these, okay? It seems to have the requirement that it be performed by an expert, it take a long time, it's very disruptive because you oftentimes have to take systems down in order to get the value out of it. And the quality of it is, since it's naturally a snapshot in time after the event has occurred, sometimes the quality is great. And other times, it's just not there, right? The evidence just isn't there. And so, when you're looking at trying to reduce the cost, remember we said that this whole thing is not sustainable. When you're trying to look at reducing the cost of an incident response, you tend to say, well, then we really want forensics to be the least common denominator, right? We want forensics to be the thing that we rely on when everything else fails, not the first thing that we rely on when we show up to the scene. All right, Rich, how close are you?
I'm not so sure. I think I may have 6.
Okay, all right, we're close then. I think I only have one more of those slides for you, so. The point probably is already made, but we'll make it even clearer at the end. We'll give you your execution too. So the fact is that we want forensics to be the least common denominator. We recognize that there's got to be a different way, right? So what I naturally did was said, okay, well, I'm going to look to the authorities. What are the authorities saying could help me reduce the cost of an incident and be better prepared, right? They have to be, since they're vendor agnostic, right? They're not going to point me towards one product or another. They're simply going to give me the model for what I should be preparing my enterprise with so that I can make this whole incident response case a lot faster. And when you look at some of these, you see that they're acknowledging that this is a big problem. In fact, being part of this industry, I'm actually quite surprised that they say that over the past 3 years, malicious activity has risen 300%. And personally, I feel like it's got to be a lot higher than that. I don't know what anyone else's statistics are on that, but it seems like 300% is small, and yet it's still an incredibly big number. And so you say, okay, they acknowledge that what the problem is, so what is it that they're going to advise me to do to help mitigate this risk, or at least respond to it much faster and cheaper? And it seems as though their response is create a breach response plan. Now, I'm pretty sure that this is going to help me because I won't be flailing around, but really a breach response plan? Let's see what they actually mean by that, right? So let's see maybe there's like some really good insights here, if I can get this to work. Maybe there's some really good insights in the NIST Computer Incident Handling Guide, right? So I dug this up and I said, okay, there's got to be, what do they mean by a breach response plan? And so I get to the first section, it's pages 7 through 18, and they outline very well for me what it is that they mean by a breach response plan. Breach response didn't fit up top, so I just called it an IR plan, but they call it a breach response plan. And if you look across the board, largely what these arrows that they're talking about are communication channels. All of pages 7 through 18 focus on figuring out who you're going to call and what role they're going to perform. That's essentially the equivalent of me saying, okay, if someone breaks into this establishment, everyone knows the number for the police, right? Okay. Everyone knows the number for police. They're the guys you call. That's it, right? No like, let's put some surveillance cameras up. Let's make sure the locks are up to grade. None of that stuff. They simply just state, okay, a breach response plan is make sure you know who to talk to. And that's it. Yeah, I'll skip that slide. And so I went to the next section thinking, okay, the first section is all about communication. The second section is all going to be about technical, right? So there's the organizational aspect of breach response plan, and then there's the like technical aspect of breach response plan, right? So what is the technical aspects of breach response plan? In fact, they spend a lot more time, 21 pages, talking about what I would hope to be this part. In fact, they have a section, the first section, which is preparation. Perfect. This is exactly what I'm looking for. So I look at that, and on the very first page of this, it says, okay, this is what you should do. A nice little checklist from NIST, exactly as you'd expect. And they say, okay, what you should do is you should make sure that you have digital forensics workstations set up, and you should make sure that you have the software to run them. Oh, and by the way, make sure you have a few notebooks. And I'm thinking to myself, we just already said that forensics should be the least common denominator, because that's what's costing everybody so much money. And yet when you look at the NIST incident handling guide, or at least the preparation guide, they're simply just perpetuating the status quo, which is you're going to have to rely on forensics. Forensics is the only way to do this. And that really doesn't make me too happy, quite frankly, because pretty much everyone's saying that. Everyone is saying that there is no hope, essentially. That these products will fail at some point or another, and your best effort when this does happen, because it's not a matter of if but when, is to rely on forensics. Last one, I think, Rich, sorry. All right. If you don't have it by now, I'm not so sure I'm going to be able to get it for you. And like I said, as a reminder, the real world doesn't have to rely on forensics, right? They have these nice little surveillance cameras. They tell me what happened, by who, what he's doing. You can see, in fact, here that what weapon was used, the fact that he has gloves on, so there's no real reason for me to go looking for fingerprints. There's a whole lot of data just in these snapshots that you can gather about what kind of things you're going to do. And you're not actually watching this event as it happened. Or right now, as it's happening, you're watching it as it did happen, right? But the fact of the matter is that if we were to provide a screen capture of the system that was compromised, that still wouldn't really answer the question. So although the real world relies on visual cues, right, visual evidence things, digital world doesn't necessarily have those sorts of attributes, those qualities. And so when looking to define what would a digital surveillance camera look like, you have to focus on, okay, well, we've got the prevention piece, right? Hundreds, if not thousands of products. In fact, most of them, do a really good job. I don't think that anyone gives them enough credit. It's a very difficult job to do. They're doing a very good job here. But what's lacking is the fact that most people have put all of their emphasis here, all of their money there, and they haven't really focused as much on the detection and the response, right? And so what would we rely on if, in fact, we were to install a surveillance camera on our computer? What would we need to do better detection and better response? And really, it comes down to you do better detection through better visibility. You do better response through traceability, right? So if I can see it, I can tell you whether that might be good or bad, okay? And if I can tell you how, in fact, that started to happen, I can actually do an effective response in the hopes that I can recover very quickly. So if, in fact, the reason that this malicious binary is here is because I have an outdated version of Chrome and it appears that Chrome was exploited, well, that allows you to recover a lot better. Not only do you get rid of the malware, but you also can say, hey, a full recovery would mean I need to upgrade Chrome. Okay, that part of it is so severely lacking in the incident response world because we quite frankly just don't have that kind of data. So we've already gone over the fact that it can't possibly be a visual screen capture, right? A continuous screen capture, because that's not really going to tell us what we need. That would be like, putting a smell sensor inside of 7-Eleven. It's not really going to give us the clues we need. So I went around and I asked a lot of people who I respect a lot. And I said, look, I gave them this pitch and I said, what would a digital surveillance camera look like? And most people responded with, well, there's lots of things you could do. You could turn on all of the logging that we have available, right? You can turn on email and OWA logging. You can turn on Windows and system event logging. You can turn on firewall logging, VPN logging, DNS logging, database logging, all of these logs, right? My question for you is, excellent. That's certainly going to be better than doing file system forensics. But it's still log file forensics, right? Because this doesn't tell me a malicious attachment was included in this email, right? And this VPN log doesn't say, hey, I've seen someone connect into the VPN that never connected in before. Not really very conclusive. And remember, we're trying to reduce all aspects of forensics, right? And one of which is requiring an expert. So we have to actually make it dirt simple. What is the question that we're going to ask? And then let's answer it. So if I use the most recent Kaspersky-Gauss report as an example, I actually found this report exceptionally intriguing, right? Because it had a ton of really good technical data, exceptional technical data, yet I'm not really sure what anybody did with it, right? So you see here, just as a real quick example, you see that in one of the modules of Gauss, right, they're talking about that the file names that they saw, Kaspersky saw, were these file names, and this is the location. In fact, they had these 6 MD5s. And a whole bunch of other attributes about the PE, right? The number of resources, what they were called, how big the file was, the compilation dates, related files, all things that are extremely helpful for figuring out whether you have a problem with Gauss. And in fact, this is just one example. Most of the indicators of compromise that we stumble across are some form of exactly this, right? It's an MD5, a file location, a network address, related files or registry keys, right? And yet, none of these logs that I was told would help me do better incident response are even going to tell me whether this file was ever on my system. And if you think about it from a hacker's perspective, the fact that this report is out there means that I'm not just going to sit around and be like, well, okay, they got me. Yeah, I'll just wait for every antivirus in the country to just start detecting this stuff. No, I'm going to change, right? I've spent 10 months undetected. 10 months undetected. I've enjoyed the fruits of my labor for 10 months. I've got a lot of great data. And now Kaspersky decides that they're going to ruin my parade. I'm not just going to let them ruin it for me. I'm just going to change as fast as I possibly can so that none of this data is relevant. So sure, we can all go out and we can look on our systems using the forensic software that NIST told us about and say, hey, is this MD5 on my system? But guess what? It won't be there. Nobody in this room actually thinks that file is going to be there. Nor is that location, nor is that file name, right? And if you look at it, this isn't just me talking here, right? If you look at the date, so going back here, the Gauss article was produced on August 9th of 2012. So that's when it became public to everybody, including me. So 2 days later, you look at one of the, I looked at this MD5. You look at VirusTotal, and they say that 4 of the 42 antiviruses in their world knew about this particular binary, okay? And more recently, 2 days ago, no surprise that overwhelmingly the vast majority of them were detecting it, right? So from a hacker's perspective, he knows that this is going to happen. And so he's trying to get ahead of that curve. And in fact, 2 days prior, or 2 days after the article was released, the report was released, only 4 of these people actually were detecting it. And this is pure signature static base analysis. We can have a whole nother discussion about that. But the fact of the matter is that I, as the attacker, do have time after this report hits to change and stay undetected. So my question for everybody, and this is really going to lead to the call to action slide that I have after this, is why not IR logs? Right? We've got all these troubleshooting logs, database logs, firewall logs, VPN logs, which largely, if you look at their contents and how they're structured, they're intended to be troubleshooting. They're intended to show you what's working and what's not and potentially why. They're not actually answering the question of, is this malicious activity occurring on my network? And how did it get here? And what did it do? And what do I do about it? Right? That's what an IR log would look like. That's what it would require for us to actually get to the point where a non-expert, a non-incident response expert could simply just look at this tape, right, the surveillance analogy, and roll it back and say, this is precisely what happened. And I could take everybody in this room, show them the same tape, and they would say, well, the man entered through the front door with another person. They dispersed, met back up, went out the front door, and made a right together. And everyone would see the same thing and say the same thing because the data is exactly what they're looking for. It's conclusive. Whereas if I were to ask everyone the same question and just say, give them the scene after the fact, some people are going to have one skill set or rely on one set of data, and other people are going to have another skill set and rely on another sort of data, which means that they're going to come up with two different answers. And so the question is, with the computer security and the computer industry largely developing big data techniques, why settle for the things that are already being created? Why settle for enabling database logs? Why settle for enabling VPN logs when we have an opportunity to create IR logs, right? We already know that it's not a matter of if, but when our network will be penetrated. And we have a whole big industry that's already started to develop after Google pioneered it, really, to simply say, we can make sense of that data now. 15 years ago, everyone would have said, it's too much. It's too much data. We can't simply tell you where every file came from. We simply can't retain all of the data that says how many DNS queries were made. But now we can, right? And so what I urge you to do, whether you're a CISO or you're a developer of some product or you're part of the IR community, whatever it is that your role is, I encourage you to start looking at moving your decision points to the right. So even if you think that a particular thing isn't malicious, log it, right? Log all those decisions you make. We can handle it now, right? The big data world is a lot more mature than it's ever been before. And there's a huge community out there right now desperately seeking answers to questions that occur every day and that are occurring even more often, 300% over the past 3 years, than they ever have before. And so no matter where you are in this food chain, right, this doesn't actually mean get rid of your prevention products. This doesn't mean hire new people necessarily. But we all have a part here. We all have a part in saying, yes, at some point this is going to fail, and we need to have something behind it. And the model of just simply relying on this isn't working. So if you are in fact producing these products, having logs that say, I saw this file and I don't think that it's malicious, is going to be important for the guys that come by after you, right? And if you're the CISO and you're trying to make a decision about a particular product or a particular strategy, sure, follow the NIST guidelines about preparing your organization, right? Preparing your people to communicate properly and to communicate with one another about the things that are relevant to their role, but also look at your infrastructure and say, what is it going to look like when this fails? What is it going to look like? What is my organization going to appear like? And what kind of disruption am I going to have if, in fact, this thing fails? And if your answer is, I'll still know the answer, I'll still know every answer that I've been questioning, then you're in a good spot. So to bring this back to the original activity, right? I knew, as the CISO of this presentation, that those cards were going to matter to me. That I was going to ask the question that said, hey, Rich, how many of those cards were stolen? Right? And what I did to Rich was I didn't prepare him well. Right? I didn't give him the tools he needed to answer that question in a timely fashion. Yet I gave Gunther everything he needed. And you can see by the results here that Gunther had every single card properly written down within minutes. Yet Rich is still sitting here frustrated that he doesn't have the information he needs. In fact, it keeps changing. Every time he thinks he understands what happened, it moves on him. And because he's looking at a snapshot in time that continues to move, he simply has a disadvantage to what Gunther had. Right? And so I encourage each of you, and the real reason I'm here talking is that I'm here to tell you that the NIST Create a Breach Response Plan is only half the battle, right? And in order to create a breach response plan that actually is going to have an effect on you as a company and everyone else involved, is to ask yourself the questions that you're going to ask yourself if something fails. And say, hey, if this fails, what am I going to ask? What is going to be most important to me? And then set up your infrastructure to be able to answer those questions conclusively, no matter who's looking at the results. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time. Question and answer period. Tom Tom has a microphone to allow anybody to ask any questions. So if you have any questions, just hail Tom down, and I'll be here to answer them. Oh, come on. I couldn't have actually answered everyone's questions. Good question. Thank you.
So these cameras that you're talking about, I mean, where are you sticking them? I've got the problem that with a lot of consumerization, I don't actually have control over any of them, a lot of my endpoints anymore. So I certainly can't stick them there. And then with full TLS, encryption being more and more common, it's hard to stick them on the network as well.
Yeah, so there's certainly not an answer for this question for everybody. And if we polled the audience, everyone would have their own sort of complications. And not having control over your own network that you're responsible for safeguarding is a problem that I'm not so sure anybody's going to be able to solve. However, if you saw here what we did in this analogy, right, I knew where I was going to put my surveillance camera. And if you looked at the 7-Eleven example I referred to, they certainly wouldn't put their surveillance camera pointed at the corner, right? They're going to put it at the cash machine, right? The cash register, because that's what's important to them. That's what they know people are going to go after. And so some of these things may in fact answer your questions conclusively, like the database logs. If all you care about, you don't really care if there's malware on your enterprise. You don't really care about an insider threat. What you really care about is who's accessing this record, this one record, which happens to be your secret sauce or your private key, right? Then put your surveillance camera there. Figure out what it is that's going to make that answer conclusive no matter who looks at it, and put your surveillance camera there. And like I said, there's a variety of different ways to do it, but the mindset that I'm really trying to get across here is that without that, you're going to be in a position where you've hired Rich, and he's going to cost you a lot of money, and he's never really going to be able to give you a definitive answer. And if you're willing to accept that and the $341,000 that comes along with it, that's risk management, right? But if you're not willing to accept that, just simply taking the advice of NIST and just creating a breach response plan might not actually get you any further than where you were today. Any other questions? We do have about 15 minutes, which, I mean, I'm not a good dancer. I don't sing at all. I do owe Gunther a beer though, so I mean, we could just go to the bar if you want. Good, thank you.
I just wanted to pick up on some of the privacy issues around having surveillance cameras. As you have a surveillance camera in a store, there's certain declarations that people have to make about that. How do you address that with your software?
So there's several ways that we could go about this, but part of it goes back to what the other gentleman brought up, which is there are in fact privacy concerns, right? As something that I'm sure you're referencing, and some institutions and some countries are going to have a problem with this, right? And so at that point, you're handcuffed. You don't really have a dog in that fight. However, we all have already gotten to the realization that as soon as we step outside of our house, there is probably some sort of camera on us at all times. We've put a blind faith, quite frankly, that nobody's going to use that to our detriment. But most of us are pretty well under the impression that at any given point, someone could follow almost our every movement. And I know that at least, and I can speak from the United States perspective, that when in fact you're issued a computer, right, it is in fact it is owned by the corporation, right? And so, law enforcement always comes up to me and says, "Hey, your surveillance camera is great. Your analogy is perfect, but like, I just can't go and put a surveillance camera on some guy that I think is going to, commit a crime." And that's because it's within the confines of his house, using his machines in his environment. But in the corporate world, which is actually spending the vast majority of that $341,000 per breach, you have a whole different environment, right? You have control, or at least most instances, you have control over your environment, and to actually take control and say, what is it that is going to matter to me most, and start collecting that all the time, is really the kind of question that I'm advocating here, right? But the two of you are obviously going to be in a position where you have to figure out what you do have control over and what you don't. And even just going through that activity of saying, I know that I could put a surveillance camera here and thus reduce the risk of a large expense in the future, but I can't put it here for these reasons, helps you communicate with whoever it is you need to communicate with. To say, we're going to incur a large expense over here because we can't put a surveillance camera there. But we can put a surveillance camera over here, and this is the difference you can expect, right? A $340,000 difference, in fact, between the two. Or maybe not needing to hire outside counsel, right? Or one of the many other positive applications of answering your question all the time versus waiting until the incident happens to try to answer it then. But the both of you are right. There are, in fact, instances where, due to privacy or due to just your ability to effect change, you're not going to be able to put a surveillance camera. You're not going to be able to put in network tap. You're not going to be able to get through SSL man-in-the-middle type situations. And that's going to be the part where you can actually quantify the difference between the two to whoever it is your stakeholder is. So I believe I'm getting the the mark from everybody else that this might be my last question.
There's plenty of time at that.
Hi. The analogy to CCTV is an interesting one because it's kind of a double-edged question, if you don't mind. The first thing is, it's not often used to detect. Normally, people aren't watching the 7-Eleven security camera and saying there's a guy with a gun. Normally, it's a case of, we've had a hold-up, rewind the CCTV, and let's watch the incident. Mm-hmm. The CCTV analogy confuses me a little bit because are we recording evidence here or are we trying to use it for the detection in the first place?
The answer to that is it's up to you. It's both. So a lot of people in this room have probably deployed SIM, right? Some sort of SIM technology, and the actual recording and storing in one particular spot is the ability for you to then view it when you need it, no matter where the source is. But if you view Splunk or any of the other things, you can also get it to alert you to when that data actually comes in, tell you things about it, right? So it is in fact both. Unlike a true CCTV analogy, where it is in fact just a replay, we could take a facial recognition analogy and say, well, this new face shows up on, again, I'm going to use a United States analogy here, the FBI's most wanted list, okay? Now, we could say, okay, great, now, we're going to start looking for that face for every new person that enters an airport, right? And that would be true facial recognition, right? But we could also then, if we had been recording all along, we could roll back the tape and do facial recognition on every frame and say, does this face match any of the airport surveillance cameras we've seen in the past, right? And notice the difference between the two, right? The difference between the two is that in one instance, just like the Gauss article, we're going forward. But the fact that they're on the FBI list means that they're probably not going to show up looking like themselves, right? They're going to show up looking like somebody else. So we get the value of now using that data retroactively to say, has this ever happened to me? And if so, what is that going to look like in the future, right? We have that value now where we can actually say, hey, Gauss was on my system, right? And if anybody actually gets to that point, Kaspersky could use a lot of help, but get to that point where you say, hey, Gauss was on my system. Well, what does it look like now? Knowing that the attacker is going to change, you can simply say, well, I've got this recording, and I know because I've been keeping the recording going the whole time that I go back in time, I see that Gauss is on there, that's the detection part, and now I can do the response. And in fact, if I knew what Gauss looked like beforehand, or I knew what I was looking for beforehand, all of that data as it streams in, just like a real CCTV, we could be analyzing it doing facial recognition, right? So it is in fact both, it's how you deploy it. But the fact is that even if you just retain the data, you'll be in a position not like Rich, but like Gunther, right?
Okay. To spin off, you talk about big data.
Yeah.
The companies that are good at big data is their business. If Google wouldn't be good at big data if they didn't make money from it. How feasible is the phenomenal amount of data the average enterprise whose business isn't big data going to find it, to mine this, pull meaningful information out of it, when even a small, medium company can produce gigs of logs in a day, an average day?
Mm-hmm. It's an excellent question. In fact, what I'd like to do is actually answer that in twofold. The first is gigabytes per day is a lot different than a terabyte at some point, right? So in fact, I could log 1,000 days on one computer and have more rich data than if I were to look at a terabyte drive after everything's happened, right? So just in terms of comparing the two data sets, you see that I can take a gigabyte worth of data a day, and it's conclusive, and it guarantees me that even without an expert, I can get the answers I want. Or I can take a terabyte, 1024 times that, at one point in time, doesn't give me conclusive evidence, and requires an expert, right? Secondly, I think that Splunk and other types of products that are good at big data, and unlike Google, have actually made their business out of big data, have done a great job, right? They have a difficult problem, but they've done a great job of being able to process any type of data. ArcSight, Nitro Security, Splunk, Logarithm, all these guys are doing exactly what you're talking about, trying to make that easy for the regular person to be able to get meaningful data out of it. And I think they're actually doing a considerably good job on the big data aspect of it. What they can't help you with, though, is giving you the alerts that mean the most to you, right? They're not the end-all be-all security shop to say, hey, this is what you should be looking for, right? Their business is big data, but they've done a great job to be able to get to the point where anybody pretty much in this room can configure and set up one of their instances, have all of their logs going to it, and give you, an enabler, give you the ability to get what you want out of it in a reasonably easy fashion. Now, how sophisticated you get is kind of up to you, but they have all the tools there for you to be able to do it. So I think to answer your question quickly, I think it's very feasible, but it's not out of the box solution.
Any other questions?
All right, well, thank you very much for attending, and hope to talk to every one of you soon.